April 11, 1945. The west bank of the Elbe River. Late afternoon. Lieutenant General William Simpson stood facing east with binoculars raised, looking down an open highway that led directly to Berlin. The distance was known. 50 miles. There were no visible German formations, no armor concentrations, no prepared defenses. The river behind him was secured. His bridgeheads were intact. His supply columns were moving without interruption. His army was fully deployed and ready. Simpson commanded the U.S. Ninth Army, nearly 300,000 men. It was the most organized and best supplied American formation in Europe at that moment. German units ahead of him were surrendering in groups, abandoning weapons, actively seeking American capture before Soviet forces arrived from the east. The Wehrmacht in front of Ninth Army no longer functioned as a coordinated force. Simpson did not deliberate. He did not consult subordinates. The opportunity was immediate and perishable. He lifted a field telephone and contacted General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. The request was direct. Permission to advance east toward Berlin. Bradley did not answer immediately. He conferred with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. When Bradley returned to the line, his response was unambiguous. The Ninth Army was to halt at the Elbe River. No advance toward Berlin was authorized. Simpson restated the situation. The road was open. Resistance was negligible. His forces were prepared to move immediately. He emphasized speed, supply, and the collapse of German command ahead. Bradley repeated the order without modification. Hold position. No further movement east. The exchange ended. The decision was final. At nearly the same time, to the south, George Patton's Third Army received identical instructions. Patton had been driving relentlessly across Germany, maintaining operational momentum at the edge of exhaustion. His forward elements were also within striking distance of the capital. He, too, was ordered to stop advancing east and prepare to redirect south. Within hours, the halt became formal policy. On April 12, Eisenhower issued written orders. The Ninth Army would remain at the Elbe. The Third Army would pivot toward Bavaria and Austria. Berlin was removed as an objective for American forces. The justification given to senior commanders was strategic. Intelligence assessments warned of a concentrated German stronghold forming in the Alpine regions. That threat, Eisenhower concluded, took precedence. On the west bank of the Elbe, the road to Berlin remained empty. American forces held their positions. The war's final decisive movement was no longer governed by battlefield conditions, but by command authority exercised far from the riverbank. By April 11, 1945, the military opportunity facing the American armies was not theoretical. It was immediate, measurable, and fleeting. The collapse of German resistance in central Germany had reached a decisive point. Organized formations no longer existed between the Elbe River and Berlin in any meaningful sense. The Wehrmacht's remaining units were fragmented remnants, lacking fuel, ammunition, communications, and command cohesion. Heavy equipment had been abandoned along the roads in retreat. Armored formations capable of mounting counterattacks were gone. What remained were isolated pockets of infantry moving west to surrender or east in disorder. The terrain favored speed. The central German road network leading to Berlin was intact. Bridges had not been systematically destroyed. There were no significant natural obstacles that could delay a mechanized advance. The landscape offered open approaches, wide highways, and multiple secondary routes. It was not defensive ground. It was transit ground. Simpson's Ninth Army had already demonstrated its capacity for rapid exploitation. In the preceding weeks, it had advanced hundreds of miles with minimal pauses, bypassing resistance rather than becoming entangled in it. Its logistical structure remained intact. Fuel, ammunition, and food stocks were flowing without interruption. Engineers had secured crossings across the Elbe at multiple points, proving that river obstacles no longer dictated operational tempo. Air superiority was absolute. German air activity had effectively ceased. American tactical air power could operate without opposition, interdicting any attempted movement or concentration ahead of the advance. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the absence of prepared defenses or troop concentrations along the Berlin axis. There were no signs of last-ditch fortification efforts, no evidence of layered defensive belts, no reserves waiting beyond the horizon. To the south, the same conditions applied. Patton's Third Army had pushed deep into Germany through speed rather than mass. Its divisions were accustomed to rapid movement, long advances, and decentralized exploitation. Commanders at every level were trained to seize opportunity without waiting for perfect conditions. The Third Army had already proven that German resistance collapsed faster than Allied planning assumptions predicted. From a purely military perspective, Berlin was not a fortress awaiting assault. It was a destination awaiting occupation. The city's symbolic value far exceeded its defensive capacity at that moment. German leadership was fractured. Communications between Berlin and remaining field commands were unreliable. Civil administration was collapsing alongside military command. The timing mattered. Soviet forces were approaching from the east, but they had not yet reached the city. Their advance was costly and contested, facing the remnants of German formations that still fought with ideological desperation against the Red Army. The Americans, approaching from the west, faced an enemy that preferred surrender to resistance. This asymmetry was critical. It meant that speed, not brute force, would determine who arrived first. Operational calculations showed that Ninth Army could reach Berlin in 48 to 72 hours. That estimate assumed cautious movement, not reckless advance. It accounted for security, logistics, and coordination. It did not require extraordinary risk. It required continuation of momentum already achieved. The opportunity was also strategic. Occupying Berlin would place American forces at the center of Germany's administrative, industrial, and political collapse. It would define zones of control before post-war boundaries hardened. It would allow the Western Allies to dictate terms on the ground rather than accept fait accompli established by others. Nothing on the battlefield prevented this outcome. No enemy action blocked it. No logistical constraint delayed it. No operational necessity demanded pause or redirection. The window was open precisely because German power had evaporated faster than Allied planning had anticipated. This was not a gamble. It was the natural culmination of successful exploitation warfare. The conditions that armies are trained to recognize: disorganized enemy, open terrain, secure supply, overwhelming superiority, were all present simultaneously. The opportunity existed only in that narrow span of days. Once momentum stopped, it could not be recovered. Once other forces arrived first, the strategic reality would harden beyond revision. At the Elbe, American commanders understood this without debate. The battlefield had spoken clearly. Eisenhower's position in early April 1945 was not one of ignorance or haste. It was the product of deliberate preparation shaped by months of accumulated assessments, planning frameworks, and precedent. For weeks, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been reviewing intelligence that suggested the war's end would not be clean. Reports circulated of a German fallback plan centered in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps. The phrase used consistently was national redoubt. It appeared in briefings, memoranda, and staff estimates. The concept described a concentrated withdrawal of elite German units into mountainous terrain, supported by underground facilities, stockpiled food and ammunition, and a leadership intent on prolonging the war through guerrilla resistance. Eisenhower took these reports seriously. He had reason to. The Italian campaign had demonstrated how effectively German forces could delay superior armies when terrain favored defense. Years of fighting had taught him that apparent collapse could mask sudden resistance. The Ardennes offensive, launched when German defeat seemed inevitable, was still fresh in his memory. He did not assume rational behavior from a regime that had already demonstrated ideological fanaticism. His preparation was therefore preventative rather than reactive. He framed the final phase of the war not as a race for symbols, but as a campaign to eliminate any remaining capacity for organized resistance. In his view, Berlin represented political closure. The Alps represented operational risk. Eisenhower's credibility rested on his ability to coordinate vast forces across national boundaries while minimizing casualties. His authority came not from battlefield flair, but from disciplined management of coalition warfare. Every major decision was filtered through its impact on alliance cohesion, logistics, and post-war stability. He was not inclined to gamble on assumptions that contradicted intelligence consensus. Within SHAEF, the intelligence picture appeared consistent. Intercepts suggested SS formations moving south. Reports from resistance networks described fortification work in mountainous regions. German propaganda amplified the narrative, promising a final stand that would bleed the Allies white. While some officers questioned the scale of the threat, none could disprove its existence conclusively. No definitive evidence existed that the redoubt was fictitious. Eisenhower prepared accordingly. He structured objectives that emphasized containment and denial. The Central German advance had already achieved its primary operational goals. The Ruhr was encircled. German field armies were disintegrating. From Eisenhower's perspective, there was no requirement to concentrate forces on Berlin if doing so risked allowing an enemy sanctuary to form elsewhere. He also prepared for the political implications of movement beyond agreed lines. The Western Allies had already negotiated occupation zones with the Soviet Union. While these agreements did not legally forbid an American entry into Berlin, Eisenhower understood that unilateral occupation would complicate relations with an ally that had borne enormous losses advancing from the east. He viewed friction with the Soviets as a future problem to be managed, not provoked prematurely. His planning reflected this caution. He emphasized secure flanks, orderly advances, and clear boundaries of control. He believed that ending the war cleanly required avoiding unnecessary confrontations, whether with residual German forces or with Allied armies converging on the same objectives. Eisenhower's preparation also involved managing his commanders. He understood the instincts of men like Patton and Simpson. He knew they recognized opportunity when they saw it. He also knew that their aggressive exploitation, while militarily sound, could outpace political frameworks that he was responsible for enforcing. His role was not to reward initiative at all costs, but to ensure coherence across the entire theater. In his assessments, Eisenhower consistently framed Berlin as inevitable rather than urgent. He believed the city would fall regardless of who arrived first. What concerned him was whether the war would truly end when it did. A prolonged insurgency in the Alps, he feared, could cost tens of thousands of additional casualties and extend the conflict into an entirely new phase. This was the lens through which he viewed April 1945. His preparation was grounded in caution, coalition responsibility, and an intelligence picture that warned against complacency. He did not dismiss battlefield opportunity. He subordinated it to a broader definition of victory. From his perspective, the greatest danger was not missing a symbolic prize, but allowing the enemy one last place to fight on their own terms. The decision did not unfold as a debate over maps or troop movements. It unfolded as an exercise in institutional control. By April 1945, Eisenhower was no longer acting solely as a battlefield commander. He was the executive manager of an alliance whose cohesion mattered as much as any tactical success. Every major movement carried political weight, and every deviation risked reopening fractures that had nearly broken the coalition before. The pressure came from several directions at once. First, there was the structure of Allied command itself. Eisenhower's authority existed only so long as Britain and the United States accepted it as balanced and impartial. British leadership had long resented the scale of American dominance on the ground. Churchill was acutely sensitive to any outcome that would leave Britain marginalized in the final victory narrative. Berlin, captured by an American army acting independently, would do exactly that. It would overshadow British participation entirely and reduce British influence in post-war negotiations. Churchill did not need to issue direct orders for this pressure to be understood. Eisenhower had spent 2 years managing British expectations, personalities, and national pride. He had already seen how quickly those tensions could escalate. Montgomery's public behavior earlier that year had nearly collapsed the alliance. Eisenhower knew that decisive unilateral action could revive that crisis at the worst possible moment. Second, there was the Soviet factor. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses advancing toward Berlin. Stalin had made it clear that Berlin carried symbolic and political significance far beyond its military value. While no written agreement barred American forces from entering the city, Eisenhower understood the practical reality. Whoever occupied Berlin would define the narrative of victory in Europe. Allowing American troops to take Berlin would not end the war faster in Eisenhower's estimation, but it would complicate the peace immediately. It risked turning an ally into an adversary before the fighting had even stopped. Eisenhower was not tasked with preparing for a post-war confrontation with the Soviet Union. His mandate was to defeat Germany while preserving Allied unity through the transition. Third, there was institutional caution within Eisenhower's own headquarters. SHAF had been built to prevent impulsive, personality-driven decisions. It favored consensus, staff validation, and risk mitigation. The intelligence community, flawed as it was, spoke with one voice about the Alpine threat. No senior intelligence officer was prepared to sign off on dismissing it entirely. In that environment, aggressive exploitation toward Berlin looked less like disciplined initiative and more like deviation from approved strategy. Eisenhower's system rewarded compliance and predictability, not operational audacity. The machinery of coalition warfare was designed to suppress precisely the kind of independent momentum that Simpson and Patton represented. Personal dynamics reinforced this restraint. Patton, in particular, was viewed as politically volatile. His past controversies were still remembered. His tendency to speak candidly, to frame decisions in ideological terms, and to dismiss diplomatic considerations made him a liability at the strategic level. Allowing Patton to spearhead a race for Berlin would have elevated him into a central political figure at the war's end. Eisenhower had no intention of empowering a commander he could not reliably control once the fighting stopped. Simpson posed a different problem. He was disciplined, professional, and respected. But Ninth Army's position at the Elbe created an operational fait accompli that threatened Eisenhower's broader framework. If Simpson crossed without explicit authorization, Eisenhower would either have to endorse the move retroactively or discipline a successful commander in full view of the alliance. Either option carried unacceptable consequences. Thus, the override was not emotional. It was procedural. Eisenhower's staff translated strategic caution into explicit orders. Halt lines were drawn. Objectives were reassigned. Authority was centralized. Once issued, these orders were not open to reinterpretation by field commanders, regardless of conditions on the ground. The language used was deliberately absolute. There would be no probing advances, no reconnaissance in force, no limited thrusts justified as local initiative. Movement east of the Elbe was forbidden. Patton's redirection south was framed as a priority mission, not a secondary task. The institutional narrative was fixed. What mattered most was control. Control over where armies moved. Control over how victory unfolded. Control over how allies perceived one another at the moment of triumph. Military logic did not disappear in this process. It was constrained. It was subordinated to alliance management, intelligence orthodoxy, and political risk avoidance. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to function. The battlefield had offered freedom of action. The command structure withdrew it. By overruling Simpson and Patton, Eisenhower ensured that the war ended within agreed frameworks rather than battlefield momentum. He prevented commanders from reshaping the political landscape through speed and initiative. He preserved coalition order at the cost of operational opportunity. The decision was not a failure of nerve. It was an assertion of institutional authority over military possibility. Once made, it could not be undone. The consequences unfolded immediately, and they were irreversible. On the west bank of the Elbe, the Ninth Army stopped moving. Its bridgeheads remained secure, its columns idle, its commanders waiting for orders that would never change. Soldiers could see eastward traffic moving toward Berlin without resistance. They could hear distant artillery from the Soviet advance. The war, for them, paused in place while history moved past them. To the south, the Third Army pivoted away from the capital. Units that had spent weeks driving east now turned their vehicles southward on command. Momentum, once broken, could not be restored. The operational rhythm Patton had built dissolved into a different mission entirely, one defined by geography rather than urgency. The Red Army did not stop. With no Western Allied pressure from the West, Soviet forces concentrated everything on Berlin. They committed scale where speed was no longer required. Over 2 million men were assembled for the final assault. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were brought forward deliberately, methodically, without fear of being beaten to the objective. When the attack began, it was not restrained. Berlin was treated as a battlefield to be crushed, not a city to be seized intact. Entire districts were leveled by artillery. Civilian casualties mounted immediately. German defenders, facing the Soviets, fought with a desperation they had not shown against the Americans. The asymmetry that had favored a Western advance now worked in the opposite direction. By the time Soviet troops entered the city center, Berlin was already destroyed as a functioning capital. Its infrastructure was shattered, its population traumatized. Its symbolic value was preserved only through its capture, not its condition. The casualty figures reflected the nature of the assault. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded. German military losses were catastrophic. Civilian deaths mounted into the tens of thousands. The city became a ruin whose fate would shape Europe for generations. Meanwhile, the American diversion produced nothing it was designed to prevent. As Patton's units advanced into Bavaria and Austria, they encountered no Alpine fortress. There were no underground factories, no prepared redoubts, no elite SS formations waiting to fight a prolonged guerrilla war. Towns surrendered without resistance. German officials fled or were captured without incident. The feared final stand simply did not exist. Berchtesgaden fell without a battle. The symbolic seed of Nazi myth collapsed as easily as any other objective. The intelligence that had driven the redirection proved empty in practice, but by then the strategic cost had already been paid. The political consequences followed quickly. With Berlin under Soviet control, occupation lines hardened. What had been provisional agreements became physical realities enforced by armies on the ground. The Western Allies could not renegotiate boundaries they did not occupy. Influence followed presence, not intent. Eastern Germany fell entirely within the Soviet zone. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and much of Central Europe followed the same pattern. American forces, having halted where they did, had no leverage to contest the emerging order. The war ended not with a negotiated balance, but with positions fixed by the last movements of armies. German surrender came days later, but the shape of peace was already determined. The location of Allied troops at the moment of victory became the map of post-war Europe. No conference would undo that reality. Within the American command, frustration remained contained but unmistakable. Field commanders understood what had been lost. They also understood there would be no reconsideration. The Halt order had been obeyed. That obedience ensured institutional cohesion even as it confirmed strategic limitation. Patton articulated the outcome bluntly in private correspondence. He recognized that Berlin was not merely a city, but a pivot point for power. Once it fell to the Soviets, the balance of Europe followed it. His assessment was not speculative. It was observational. Simpson said little publicly. His role was not to argue history, but to execute orders. His army had been ready. That readiness would never be tested at the scale it was built for. The broader consequence extended far beyond Germany. The division of Europe emerged not from ideological debate, but from operational geometry. Armies stopped where they were told to stop. Others advanced where they were permitted to advance. The result was a line that would soon acquire a name, a border that would harden into doctrine. The Iron Curtain was not declared. It was drawn. Eisenhower's decision achieved its immediate objectives. The war ended without Allied infighting. There was no confrontation with Soviet forces in Berlin. Coalition unity was preserved through the moment of victory. American casualties were minimized in the final weeks. But these outcomes came with trade-offs that could not be reversed. Berlin's capture defined legitimacy in post-war Germany. Soviet authority in the capital translated into political control across the eastern half of the country. Western influence stopped where Western armies stopped. The leverage that might have come from occupying the enemy's political heart was forfeited deliberately. The absence of an Alpine insurgency confirmed that the intelligence assessment had been wrong. But intelligence errors only matter when decisions remain adjustable. By the time the error was exposed, adjustment was impossible. What followed was not a mistake corrected by hindsight, but a condition endured for decades. The halt at the Elbe did not merely end an advance. It finalized a geopolitical settlement enforced by absence. It ensured that the last decisive movement of the European war belonged to the Red Army alone. From that moment forward, the consequences no longer belonged to generals. They belonged to borders, regimes, and alliances that would define the next half-century. The battlefield had ceased to be the arena where outcomes were decided. That role had already passed to the command room, and there, the decision had already done its work. In the years after the war, the record became complete. Memoirs, staff papers, and declassified intelligence removed any remaining ambiguity about what had driven the halt at the Elbe and what it had achieved. The documents did not reveal hidden conspiracies or suppressed objections. They revealed something more ordinary and more consequential, a decision made within accepted institutional logic that produced outcomes no one later disputed, but few publicly defended. The most critical revelation concerned the national redoubt. Post-war investigations by American military intelligence found no evidence of an organized Alpine fortress. There were no stockpiled reserves capable of sustaining long-term resistance. No underground industrial complexes. No coordinated SS withdrawal plan. German units that moved south had done so to surrender, regroup administratively, or escape Soviet capture, not to prepare a final stand. German records confirmed it. Interrogations of senior officers revealed no redoubt doctrine beyond propaganda. Goebbels had promoted the concept deliberately to project resilience and sow uncertainty among the Allies. It worked. The narrative survived long enough to influence Allied operational priorities at the decisive moment. Eisenhower acknowledged this indirectly in later reflections. He did not dispute that the intelligence had been wrong. He emphasized instead that decisions could only be judged by the information available at the time and by the responsibilities attached to his role. His writing consistently framed the halt not as a missed military opportunity, but as a necessary political accommodation. Bradley's memoirs echoed that view. He described the Berlin question as settled before April 1945, not by geography, but by alliance agreement. He emphasized that friction with the Soviets at the moment of German collapse would have endangered broader strategic objectives. His tone was defensive but firm. The decision, he maintained, had prevented worse outcomes. Patton's post-war record stood apart. His letters, diaries, and dictated recollections left little doubt that he understood the long-term implications immediately. He did not argue that Berlin would have ended the war faster. He argued that Berlin would have defined the peace. In private correspondence, he described the halt as a surrender of influence rather than territory. He did not soften that assessment with time. Simpson left no comparable written critique. His silence was itself revealing. As a professional commander, he accepted that execution, not advocacy, defined his role. The absence of protest in his record did not reflect agreement. It reflected discipline. Soviet archives completed the picture from the opposite side. Red Army planning documents show that Soviet commanders fully expected to reach Berlin without Western interference once American forces stopped. They adjusted timelines and force allocations accordingly. The massive concentration of artillery and manpower was not rushed. It was deliberate. There was no fear of being preempted from the West. Soviet political reporting made the significance explicit. Capturing Berlin was understood as a legitimizing act. It justified Soviet authority in Eastern Europe and validated wartime sacrifice in the eyes of both domestic and international audiences. That legitimacy translated directly into post-war leverage. Western leaders recognized this after the fact. Churchill's later writings make clear that he understood the implications once Berlin fell. His frustration was evident, though carefully expressed. He did not challenge Eisenhower's authority directly. He acknowledged instead that once American forces halted, Britain had no independent capacity to alter the outcome. The Cold War did not begin with speeches or declarations. It began with positions. The line where American armies stopped became the line where influence stopped. Conferences and agreements followed, but they formalized realities already established by troop placement. No document undid what operational decisions had locked in place. Historians reviewing the episode have largely converged on the same conclusion. Eisenhower acted rationally within his mandate. He prioritized alliance stability over unilateral advantage. He avoided confrontation at the moment of victory. He ended the war cleanly. They also agree on what that choice cost. Berlin's occupation determined Germany's division. That division shaped European politics for decades. The presence of Soviet forces at the center of Germany ensured that Eastern Europe would remain under Soviet influence until the end of the Cold War. These outcomes were not unintended consequences. They were accepted risks. The post-war record does not suggest that Eisenhower was unaware of them. It suggests that he judged them preferable to the alternatives he perceived at the time. That judgment was never reversed. With the passage of time, the decision hardened into precedent. Military opportunity was shown to be subordinate to political structure at the highest level of coalition warfare. Commanders learned that speed and success could be constrained by considerations entirely removed from the battlefield. The Elbe Halt became less a controversy than a reference point, not because it was debated endlessly, but because it no longer needed to be debated at all. The results were visible on every map of post-war Europe. By the time the archives opened, the borders had already lasted a generation. The record was complete. There were no remaining documents that altered the conclusion. The decision had done exactly what it was meant to do. The case closes at the Elbe. On April 11, 1945, the war in Europe reached a point where battlefield conditions no longer determined the outcome. American armies stood within reach of Berlin. The enemy was broken. The road was open. The decision to stop was not forced by resistance, terrain, or logistics. It was imposed. The Halt order reflected the priorities of coalition command, not operational necessity. Eisenhower chose control over exploitation. He chose alliance management over unilateral advantage. He accepted flawed intelligence because it aligned with institutional caution and political equilibrium. That choice worked exactly as intended. The war ended without confrontation between allies. The surrender was orderly. Casualties in the final days were minimized for American forces. Command authority remained intact through the moment of victory. But the cost was structural. Berlin fell to the Red Army. With it fell the ability of the Western Allies to shape the political center of Germany. The line where American armies stopped became the boundary of Western influence. Everything east of it hardened into a separate world. No later conference changed that. No speech reversed it. No clarification amended it. The absence of an Alpine redoubt confirmed the intelligence failure, but confirmation came after relevance. Once armies halted, the outcome was locked. Momentum surrendered cannot be reclaimed by hindsight. Eisenhower did not lose control of events. He exercised it. He understood the implications. He accepted them. He judged them preferable to the risks. Berlin defined the peace because Berlin was allowed to do so. The Western Allies won the war. They did not win the capital. That distinction shaped Europe for the next half-century. The file is closed. If you want more investigations into the decisions that quietly decided history, subscribe. If you have an assessment of this one, leave it in the comments.